The conference room went completely silent when Marcus Bennett was fired. Not quietly, not privately, but in front of nearly 30 employees, with his worn work bag still hanging from his shoulder and a half-finished cup of coffee sitting beside his laptop. Richard Caldwell, the company's powerful CEO, stood at the head of the table and told Marcus that his position was being eliminated effective immediately. Marcus looked around at the people he had worked beside for 7 years, swallowed the lump in his throat, and simply nodded. What nobody in that room knew was that Marcus had spent the previous night awake at his kitchen table, calculating whether his paycheck would be enough to cover his daughter's school supplies, rent, and the prescription his elderly father needed. He had walked into that office carrying more than a briefcase, he had carried the weight of an entire family. If you believe kindness, hope, compassion, forgiveness, and second chances can change someone's life, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Marcus had never been the loudest employee at Caldwell Industries. He was the man who arrived early, fixed problems before anyone noticed them, and stayed late without expecting praise. After his wife passed away several years earlier, he became a single father to his 9-year-old daughter, Grace. He never used her situation to gain sympathy. Instead, he worked harder. Every morning, he packed Grace's lunch before driving her to school, then continued to the office with barely enough time to drink his coffee. Grace knew her father was tired, but she also knew he never complained. She often left little handwritten notes in his lunch bag, simple messages like, "You are the best dad," or "I love you more than pizza," and those tiny pieces of paper had become Marcus's private treasures. The trouble began when Richard Caldwell returned from a business trip determined to cut expenses. Marcus was one of the employees whose department had been struggling, even though most of the problems had started before he became responsible for it. Marcus had tried to explain the situation, showing Richard detailed reports and offering a plan that could save the company money without eliminating jobs. Richard barely listened. He had already decided that Marcus was expendable. So, when the meeting began that Friday morning, Marcus knew something was wrong, but he never imagined his career would end before everyone he respected. After being dismissed, Marcus quietly collected his belongings. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse Richard of being unfair. He simply thanked his co-workers and walked toward the elevator. On the way out, he stopped at his desk and noticed Grace's latest note tucked beneath his keyboard. He smiled sadly, placed it in his pocket, and left the building. Richard remained in the conference room, irritated by the uncomfortable silence that followed. He began gathering the papers from the table when something caught his attention. Beneath Marcus's chair was a small blue envelope. Richard picked it up, expecting perhaps a company document. Instead, written across the front in a child's handwriting were the words, "For Daddy, when work gets hard." Curiosity overcame him. Inside was a drawing of Marcus wearing a superhero cape, standing beside Grace beneath a bright yellow sun. Underneath the picture were several handwritten sentences. Grace had written that her father was the kindest person she knew, that he always helped people even when nobody thanked him, and that she hoped one day she could become strong like Daddy. But beneath the drawing was something else that made Richard stop breathing for a moment. It was a printed photograph from a company charity event. Marcus was standing beside an elderly janitor, Mr. Samuel Price, who had tears in his eyes. Richard remembered that man. Samuel had nearly lost his apartment the previous winter, and someone had anonymously paid several months of his rent. Richard had assumed the donation came from the company. It hadn't. Marcus had paid it himself. Richard searched through the papers left on Marcus's desk and discovered more stories. Marcus had quietly purchased groceries for an employee whose husband was hospitalized. He had covered transportation costs for a coworker whose car had broken down. He had even refused a promotion once because accepting it would have required another employee to lose their position. Richard suddenly realized that the man he had publicly called replaceable had spent years making himself valuable to everyone except himself. He immediately called Marcus, but there was no answer. Marcus was sitting in his old car outside Grace's school, staring at his phone and wondering how he would tell his daughter that their life was about to change. Then Richard arrived. Marcus looked surprised when the CEO approached his car. Richard didn't bring paperwork or excuses. He brought the blue envelope and the company folder containing Marcus's records. For the first time, Richard admitted that he had judged Marcus without knowing his story. He apologized for humiliating him and offered him something more meaningful than simply restoring his old position, leadership of a new employee support division designed around the very ideas Marcus had been trying to introduce. Marcus hesitated. He had every reason to refuse. But Grace had taught him that forgiveness didn't mean pretending someone hadn't hurt you. Sometimes forgiveness meant choosing not to let someone else's mistake decide who you became. Months later, Marcus walked through the same office doors, but this time people stood and applauded. His new program helped employees facing financial emergencies, family hardships, and unexpected crises. Richard became less interested in looking powerful and more interested in listening. And on Marcus's desk sat Grace's blue envelope, now framed beneath a simple photograph of father and daughter. One evening, Richard saw Marcus looking at that picture and asked what made him keep going during the hardest days. Marcus smiled and said that sometimes a person survives difficult seasons because someone believes in them before they can believe in themselves. If this story touched your heart, please support it with a like, share it with someone who could use a little encouragement, and leave a comment to tell us what you believe matters more in life: success, forgiveness, or kindness. Your words may reach someone quietly fighting their own difficult battle. And before you leave, remember Marcus's lesson: never measure a person's worth by the moment when they are at their lowest. Sometimes the person you overlook is the person carrying more courage, love, and goodness than you will ever see. A job can be taken away in a few seconds, but character cannot be fired. And sometimes, the thing someone leaves behind after being pushed away is not a mistake or a failure, but a reminder of the kind of person they truly were.